He believed he was having a typical morning on the farm, but as he got closer to the old barn, everything changed. 3 infants were lying on the chilly ground beneath a blanket. Who were they, and why were they? They saw. And above all, what the farmer did that shocked everyone? Him from subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video in the east. A faint bluish glow stretched over the sky, which had just started to fade. The dew still adhered to the frozen grass. Across Iowa's wide deserted fields it was early March, and the land's breath was a peaceful mist that languidly floated across the exposed ground. Even though spring softly pulled at the borders of everything the Grayson farm was hidden at, the chill of winter persisted in the air. A few kilometers from the closest freeway, the end of a lengthy gravel road was quiet and still but for the figure of a man putting his cap on and dragging a bulky wool coat over his shoulders as he went out onto the porch. The 53-year-old Wind Thomas Grayson has been beaten by more than just the sun. His boots, which were broken and old, thudded dully on the wooden stairs as he went down, holding a torch in one hand and a thermos of black coffee in the other. Wasn't absolutely required given the dim light emerging over the fields, but his habits had become so ingrained in him that they affected every action he took. Each step has a rhythm shaped by years of practice. He drank some of the gravel crunched as he started his usual stroll toward the barn, squirming at the harshness of the coffee. In the drowsy world around him, the only sound beneath his feet was that of birds. Even if the cows in their shelter were still sleeping. It was his favorite time of day, before the commotion, before the duty, before the recollection. Thomas wasn't always alone himself. The home behind him used to be occupied by peaceful happiness and cozy noises. His wife Catherine had passed away 6 years prior. From cancer is a quick and cruel disease that always seemed to be cancer one day while she was working in the garden. And the next, following her passing, Thomas had seen her fading like the last rays of sunlight. Withdrew into the land's quiet, taking solace in the certainty of duties, animal devotion, and the icy neutrality of the soil. He and Catherine. The physicians had tried treating the youngsters for years. Only the 2 of them, and the gradual resignation that perhaps it wasn't intended to be. The house had an extra bedroom that they used once for visitors, and he hadn't opened the door for storage in years that morning, such as innumerable times previously. He started his rounds by examining the fences and checking the feed. He entered the barn's ancient red door and heard the usual squeak of the chickens. The cows stared at him, greeting him with the scent of hay and soft animal breath. Unconcerned, he went stealthily amongst them, scooping feed and checking water levels. His favorite here, Rosie, snuggled against him and patted his flank with a gentle lowing sound. Everything was in order, and he took a step back. Outside, the sun wasn't up, and he raised his face slightly toward the dawning sky. He took another drink of coffee, but it was still light enough to push through the clouds and give the fields a dull silver. So he listened for a minute while standing motionless, and then he saw it was hardly. A black bulge toward the far edge of the land was apparent from where he stood, to the ancient, abandoned equipment shed, which was partially obscured by the land's curvature and the tall, wild grass. He initially believed it may be an animal or a tarp that had been discarded. Something about it seemed strange even though it wasn't there, curled up against the cold. When he was certain of it the day before, he approached it with his boots slightly dipped. As he approached, his speed slowed and an odd uneasiness descended on the wet ground. The heaviness in his chest became more distinct when a knot of fabric ripped at the borders with something tucked below it, and he paused every few steps. He was abruptly aware of his instincts. The wind was still, yet he sensed a shift in the air as though it were just before a storm. He knelt down and cautiously reached out with calloused hands to raise the cloth's corner. 3 little faces, only a bit more than one of the month-olds. Huge blinking eyes twitched as they gazed up at him. Another sobbed quietly, their lips being so chilly that their cheeks turned pink. Someone had wrapped them firmly in neat but old baby cloths while they were shaking, covered with sheets that had a subtle lavender and smoke-like plastic scent. 2 little bottles, a partially used pack of diapers, and a folded note. Thomas looked blankly. For an instant the globe dwindled to that area of icy terrain. and the impossibly heavy weight of this mind was so systematic that it refused to absorb the breath that stuck in his throat. He looked around and saw 3 babies by alone on his property, automatically looking to the trees, the road beyond, the field and the far horizon. But there was no car, no movement. There was no indication of anyone, only the sky becoming brighter and the wind blowing through the fence post, and his heart was racing. He paused, then reached down and picked up the first kid, then the next, and the chest louder than it had been in years. Last but not least, take care to keep them swaddled. They were delicate and more heavier than they appeared, into his flesh as he held them in his arms, frantically trying to keep all 3 from falling out. Now, without pausing to consider, the door banged as they crossed the yard back to the house. Open, beneath his foot, and as he entered, heat brushed his face. He set the baby at a time on the couch, then tossed some logs into the fireplace, and with shaking hands, he ignited it by searching the kitchen for a pot. Of his thoughts were racing. As he warmed the water on the stove, who would do this and why? Tested each bottle individually. The milk was chilly, but they enthusiastically drank it, all instinct, and he moved in response to anything without saying a word or crying. When he eventually took a seat next to them, he discovered he hadn't breathed, and after a few minutes they were silent and breathing restfully. Meanwhile, the sun has risen, illuminating the fire with a light gold tint through the lace curtains. Popped once, and Thomas reached out, staring at the kids he didn't know about, and without bothering to fix the logs, what to do, but he suddenly realized with depressing clarity that he couldn't. The fire in the hearth had gone out, so don't turn away now or ever, to a dim orange light that creates lengthy, fading shadows on the ancient. The warmth of the fire kept farmhouse, Thomas still as he sat in the rocking chair, reaching just his legs, his shoulders remaining frigid and stiff. The 3 babies were wrapped in heavy quilts he had, and were lying side by side on the couch. They slept upstairs, quickly removing themselves from the linen box, each with their. The room was silent, with little fists clenched, lips twitching, and unconscious gestures. He didn't know how long he sat there, only interrupted by the fire's crackle and the kids' soft, regular breathing. Like manner while observing them, his thoughts occasionally straying from the task at hand, or he had twice gotten up to see how the milk bottles were doing, warming them once more in a saucepan of, I'm not sure how much hot water the infants needed or how long they had consumed. They had each taken a few ounces, which was sufficient to stop their sobs and calm them to sleep, but he was plagued by doubt because there was no guide for. This, along with any insights he may have had, seemed overshadowed by years of, with tense fingers, he grabbed the phone and dialed the sheriff's workplace. The number was displayed on a card that had been yellowed and affixed to the refrigerator, to a fading summer 1994 snapshot of him and Catherine. She gazed at him as he talked into the receiver, his tone careful and low, as if he were speaking the words himself. Clearly, the 3 infants discovered on his property without a message, or a car may be true. There was no evidence of anyone, and at first the dispatcher seemed unsure of what to say. After a prolonged period of silence, she indicated she would send someone out and inquired if he informed her that the kids were hurt, but that it wasn't obvious because they were warm and now nourished. Breathe for a bit. Despite their knowledge, he repeated his address and hung up by. When he returned to the sofa, one of the infants had roused the girl, he believed, as she looked up at him, her forehead wrinkled and her eyes hazy blue. She gave him a half scowl. That made him think of someone he couldn't possibly recognize. He leaned down to pull her into his arms after hearing a mooing scream, but it was an unnatural motion. However, his hold remained firm as he held her in his arms and bounced her slowly. The sound faded into little whimpers, and while his back and arms ached, he nevertheless. 40 minutes after the pounding on the door, Sheriff Dalton was aiming with broad shoulders, deep wrinkles around his eyes, and a speech pattern that seldom ever altered tempo. Regardless of suddenly, he entered and stopped to see the flames in front of him. The 3 babies in Thomas's arms, the 2 sleeping babies and the blankets. Jesus, Tom, he said, taking off his hat as a woman appeared behind him. Thomas didn't identify a younger person, perhaps in their mid-30s, with a clipboard under one arm, and her hair was pulled back, and her thick coat made her appear even tiny than she actually was. back in a low bun, and she quietly and precisely scanned the room before introducing herself as Child Protective Services Monica Reyes, gave Thomas a rigid nod. He had nothing to conceal, yet he felt vulnerable. The sheriff approached the sofa and knelt down, his gaze softening as he watched the kids. "Where have you located them?" Thomas replied. Out past the old shed, draped with a blanket, there was a bag containing the milk diapers, and he shook his head without saying anything. Head Reyes had already approached and was examining the faces of the sleeping babies, their limbs whispering to herself in a voice that Thomas was unable to understand. She inquired as to if he had given them food, and he replied that he had. When asked how long they had been there, he estimated that they had been there for a few hours because the wind had subsided after daylight, and he hadn't heard anything at night. But he assumed that anything was conceivable because they were working well in the dark. Reyes took pictures and took notes while the babies were carefully raised and inspected. Reyes inquired as to if there were any security cameras on the more tightly wrapped. Thomas nearly chuckled as he said, "No, not here, not on this country where nothing had never occurred worth documenting that he had seen no tires when no one had passed by. The gravel road had wet footprints and older, scarred impressions." Dalton strolled around the property's perimeter, looking for traces or hints, but returned empty-handed, saying they were left here, and drawing his coat closer. Purposefully, someone wanted them found. That idea became like a stone. Thomas followed them back into the house and watched as Reyes used her cell phone to make a couple calls and discussed emergencies in hushed tones. Open beds in shelters and courage. Availability of the closest available. Nearly 90 miles to the south was a facility with an infant unit, and they weren't sure. As she flipped through the sheets on her clipboard, she scowled and said, they could take all three together. The paperwork and logistics proceeded more slowly than anybody had hoped. Finally, she continued, "If you're willing, I'd like to ask you to admit, Mr. Grayson. It's not normal, but we're overloaded, so please keep the kids here for a few days, until we arrange a placement. And this would only be considered an emergency kinship placement." "Temporary," Thomas gazed at her, uncertain whether he had understood her when he said, "I'm not family," he said. "No, but you are the only one who has fed them today." Her tone was kind, "But since you kept them warm, you are the closest thing to family they have at the moment." Manipulating, even though she could see a guy who could assist them in front of her. Bridge a gap. Perhaps she was blind to the years of quiet or the evenings when he was still said out loud to an absent woman, or the way his hands shook as he either saw everything and didn't notice, or she held something as fragile as a baby. With concern, he glanced down at the girl in his arms. Her lips was now closed. "I'll need some help," he murmured slowly, limp with sleep, "and I'll make arrangements for supplies." "I've never hesitated," she said. "I don't know what I'm doing. No one does." Reyes stated that first. The sheriff touched Thomas's shoulder. "But you don't need to make a long-term commitment, just keep them safe till we sort this out." Reyes handed him a list of things, but Thomas nodded more to himself than to them. She would return with additional diapers, formula, a portable cot, and some baby. Dalton instructed him to phone if she didn't return the garments by the evening. They departed together, strolling along the dirt path in the direction of their, gradually, the house's quiet gradually returned, as to fog encroaching. Thomas stood in the living room with the message after the wind had ceased. Reyes had the infant in one hand as the other two remained asleep. Their gentle and regular breathing. He didn't sit for very long since his legs hurt, and he finally, being cautious not to disturb the others, he put the youngster back onto the couch next to them and proceeded gently to the kitchen, and discovered that there was no baby-safe food in the refrigerator. Contents of a life jar, half-eaten casserole, a jug of milk, eggs, and butter lived alone. And for the first time in years, he noticed as he gazed at the shelves how his house was indeed deserted once the sun had risen. He sat at the table with a pencil and a legal pad when the house had warmed up, started compiling a list of formula bottles, wipes, and bathing diaper, cream infant thermometer. He was unaware of the appearance of half of these items, although he had heard the phrases before he contacted the local drugstore to inquire about baby supplies. The woman on the other end of the phone said, acknowledged his voice, and promised to have a package ready when he arrived. He had time, so he wrapped them again and looked at the sofa, which was still asleep. He wrapped them in the finest blankets. He owned and carefully placed each one in a cardboard box before carrying them to his truck, lined with towels. He convinced himself that since he didn't have car seats, it would only be. He drove slowly on this one journey, and every bump on the road seemed like a shock to his conscience. He kept an eye on their little heads and examined the rearview mirror. Swing, with every turn, yet they never once shed a tear at thee. Without asking, the drugstore clerk assisted in carrying the items to the vehicle. Inquiries. But when she saw the kids, her face softened, and he thanked her. Back at home, he placed the infants down on the rug, hardly able to face her gaze. In front of the fireplace, and opened the bags to see a set of pacifiers, diapers, and lotion that were quite little. Wipes a thermometer, changes 3 onesies with animal designs, and starts something new one by one. He stumbled, muttering curses and expressing regret out loud. His hands seemed too large and his body moved too slowly, yet he was able to writhe. But by the time Reyes brought back a folding cot and apple of documents, the living room resembled a cross between a nursery and a rummage sale, and she demonstrated to him how to correctly mix the formula, how to burp them after feeding, and how to determine whether they are either too hot or too chilly. So she left her mobile phone number and instructions. When the door finally closed behind him, he thanked her without knowing what else to say, after seeing the number written in block letters. The house seemed fuller to her, not noisier but fuller in the sense that Thomas sat down next to the crib, a presence that had been unknown for years. He sighed and put his arms on his knees, unsure of how long this would endure. There were 3 kids tonight, but he had no idea what the future held. For the first time in a long time, it seemed like I was sleeping at his house. The home had never known anyone else breathing in the walls save him, not even during the first several years of his marriage, when Catherine would cook and listen to music while keeping all the windows open to allow the soft hum of the radio fill the room. Had there been such a persistent, penetrating pandemonium in the fields, it finally arrived. Like an unseen thread connected, one child begins in waves, followed by the others. Thomas walked among them like a man, their lungs all pulling at the same rhythm. A steady but resolute slip, his arms constantly full, his face pinched with focus. His sleeves were often pulled up and his shirt was frequently soiled the first. He had only slept for maybe 20 minutes here, and the night had been a bearable catastrophe. A few more there. The babies had woken up one by one, but never simultaneously. One needed to be changed, and there was no rhythm or pattern, just screams that sounded like sirens in the dark. He never understood why he just wanted to be held around 3:00 in the morning. In the morning, Dad was seated on the living room floor with all 3 infants tucked against his chest. The third hiccuped softly, partly sleeping. The fire had gone out to embers and there was a chill. He didn't stir or even flinch as the draft came in through the rear door. Listened to their breath while sitting with unfocused eyelids, and in the morning his limbs ached from the burden of them, from the ungainly bending, rocking, and hauling. He made a cup of coffee that was so potent that when he contacted the county health nurse, his voice almost burnt his tongue. Left a note that said, "I have 3 babies in my home." He didn't disclose that he hadn't slept for more than an hour since they arrived, but he did say, "I could use some advice. Seem worthy of being mentioned, but it was only a fact, like the gloomy sky." Days flew by, and he either learnt quickly or made an effort to between feedings and changes. He made blunders by reading articles on the internet on his phone and making the formula overly hot. One infant had a slight rash from having 2 loose diapers, and he almost freaked out. One morning, believing he had already failed, he stood in the pharmacy aisle and studied all the labels on. He grasped the tiniest tube he had purchased from the shelf of ointments, his fingers shaking. More materials. Blankets, a second crib, a little white noise generator, and someone. He still didn't fully get half of what the pharmacist at the drugstore stated, but he nodded as if he did, and people started to recognize him, or at least be familiar with the tale of the silent guy with the infants. When a farmer on Route 12 discovered 3 babies in his field, he kept them to himself. However, he couldn't help but notice that someone had left a tiny bag at the feed shop. There were baby socks, an anonymous message, and a $20 bill on the windshield of his truck. Bill was hiding in the corner, unsure of how to express his thankfulness. He wasn't a charity case, of course, but he also didn't discard it. Even though the physical tiredness was persistent, it wasn't the worst aspect. Was the nagging suspicion that he was tinkering with lives that, sometimes in the quiet between sobs, they deserved better than speculation. He would imagine someone coming on the door to tell him it was all an error as he sat in the armchair and gazed at the wall, that his biological parents had shown themselves so he could resume his peaceful, predictable life. But each time that notion surfaced, it was followed by another. The way they relaxed when they saw his face and the expression in their eyes kept them warm and trusting by bearing their weight on his chest. They were present even, though he hadn't requested them, and he was unable to bring to wish everything had been different. But on the 5th day, something changed for him. The kitchen, attempting to prepare himself some food as the kids slept, cracking eggs with one hand and toasting in the other. On the other, a slow country song was playing on the radio in the background. Failed to realize he was halfway through cooking when he was drawn back by a soft, almost. He entered and observed one of the happy gurgles followed by a breathy chuckle. Lads? He had been mentally referring to them by the numbers 1, 2, and 3 ever since. It felt too definitive to name them, and I was grinning up at the ceiling, rather than at him or anyone else. Specifically, simply grinning in a way that resembled sunlight. Thomas? He didn't move as he stood there with the spatula in his hand and his heart in his throat. Spoke, just observed. And then he held the infant for a little while longer, allowing him to rest on his. Snow was expected in a few days, he thought. As he gazed out the window at the sparse trees across the fields, he would have to check the generator and split more wood in the final moments of winter, but he began to notice their smile, and that was all he could think about. One personality was more picky and incessantly in need of warmth and attention. Another was still observing everything with wide, inquisitive eyes. The third had a cry that grew like a storm, first faint, and later, if not loud, thunderous. Calmed, they were starting to seem real to him. Not just babies, not just on the 7th day. The nurse phoned the responsibility people, and her name was, with a gentle yet strong tone, Leah Monroe stated that she had read the report and was aware of it. Thomas accepted his offer of a house visit before he had a chance to consider it, even if he wasn't related. Despite her best efforts, she arrived the following morning in a county vehicle that kicked. She was middle-aged, friendly, and efficient as she went through the home, releasing dust into the air. Before checking the baby's temperatures and taking notes, she congratulated them as though she had done it 1,000 times. According to his organization, he was doing well overall. "You're tired," she stated frankly, and he nodded. "You're responsible for everything by yourself." He nodded once more, and she gave him another glance before saying, "I can set up some assist a visiting nurse on a part-time basis. Perhaps someone could check in once a week." Thomas wanted to explain that he didn't require assistance, but he couldn't find the right words. Nodded once more that afternoon when the infants were sleeping. He went outside to the barn, where he stood and inhaled the fragrance of grain and hay, hands on his hips in the center of the floor, and gazed about as if he were a stranger in his own world. Everything had been as it was usually, familiar and neat, but he had changed. Instead of going into town that day, he remained nearby, going from room to room. He looked over them, held them, and sang to them with a kind of delicate awareness he hadn't realized he had. Softly, off-pitch, a song from his early years that he hardly recalled. The third boy's stormy one slept through the night from midnight to 4 o'clock, longest period yet, and when Thomas awoke and understood that the silence wasn't fleeting, he watched as the heart pounded over the crib, but not out of terror. Perhaps it was optimism that the home was still a mess, with diapers all over the place and laundry everywhere. He had not touched the tractor in more than a year, and he was stacking bottles that needed to be cleaned. He wasn't sure how he would manage anything throughout the week while the fields were waiting, but he didn't dread for the first time in years, and the infants were safely fed warm. He cracked open the bedroom window in the morning and breathed in that evening, There was work to be done, yet he could sense the change in the breeze and the chilly air. He was no longer afraid since the wind outside had shifted. It still had a chilly sting to it, but it also hinted at something more. Days that are just long enough to think that spring could arrive at thawing fields, melting ice return. It moved across the Grayson farm like a silent pledge, seeping between the ancient windows' crevices and the barren limbs of the trees. The farmhouse's interior was pushed back against by the warmth of the hearth, and the Thomas sat at the kitchen table, and the air had a subtle scent of milkwood smoke and baby powder. Pencil in hand in front of him, elbows resting on the scratched surface, was yet another list. But this one was much more thorough than any he had ever created. It was a schedule that included feeding times, naps, and more than simply work or supplies. Amounts of formula, expected monthly expenses, and supermarket runs that he had completed the calculation 3 times before, and he was repeating it not because he anticipated a change in the figures, but rather because he needed to confront them in order to think he could make things work. The babies were asleep in the room across the hall, and I was alone in the kitchen for the time being. What was clearly a nursery and had previously been the guest bedroom folding cribs had been swapped out with stronger, used but sturdy wooden ones that were given to them by a couple in town who'd read about them in the county paper, and the room now smelt more like talcum and dust than it did before. The shelves were stocked with warming toys, and a nightlight gave out a gentle golden glow after. The rocking rocker was covered by dark Catherine's quilt, which had been hanging in the linen closet unattended for almost 10 years. He used to check the clock each night before the municipal office opened in Ann. He could arrive at the courthouse within an hour and have the forms by 10 guard completed by midday, allowing him to alter his mind, but the idea didn't linger as long as it had It didn't mock him at first like it had on those early evenings when uncertainty seeped into every crevice of his decide that it was no longer an instinct, but rather a decision, when Monica Reyes returned for her planned check-in 1 week prior. She had brought a clipboard and formula, but she had also brought up the next step of legally requesting temporary guardianship, which would provide him access to more resources, make him eligible for government assistance, and, more crucially, guarantee. The kids couldn't remain in limbo indefinitely, so he would either take the next if Thomas hadn't responded correctly. The department would start looking for a permanent post elsewhere. He bowed and stated he needed time to reflect, which she had accepted, but He stretched his shoulders and walked to the words that lingered with him. A week ago, the floor in the living room cracked under his weight. Still maintained the appearance of his former existence, but now baby things had infiltrated every corner, blankets on the couch, toys beneath the table, and a diaper box that should have been chaotic and disturbed him near the fireplace. But instead, it felt as though a long-shuttered compartment in his heart had had its seal softly shattered. It was movement, something breathing instead of sadness. He opened the door to the nursery and walked down the corridor as quietly as possible, still dozing off in their individual cribs wrapped with blankets and breathing quietly. He observed them for a while as the window's early light shone on their faces, as they listened to their small lungs beat, the sporadic twitch of a. They appeared calm, hand or foot, as if they had never experienced terror. He didn't know their names, but they seemed to belong here, feeling hungry or cold. No missing persons report had been received, and the state had not yet recognized them. For the time being, Mother had come out, and they were simply mentioned in the documents as baby A, B, and C, but Thomas had names in mind for them based on the days, and after many nights of observing, holding, and learning, he now spoke their names. He examined their blankets and repositioned their pacifiers, without yet revealing their true identities, one for each cot. Formal, just a private matter between them, and he returned to the kitchen. After grabbing his coat and pouring the remaining coffee into his thermos, the vehicle began on the second attempt. Coughing against the chill, the calm, snowy drive into town, he passed the same barns that were in the ditches, but the roads were clear. He had seen the same mailboxes and deserted fields for decades, yet they seemed distinct now, like sections of a path rather than marks on a map at the clerk at the courts gave him a wary grin that she had obviously heard. Without posing any questions, she gave him the documents in front of everyone. stayed on the line for a bit too long before writing his name beneath the petitioner, and he filled them out It was a slow process for him, sitting at a table in the lobby with a coffee ring staining the corner of the page and a pen that skipped. He double-checked each part out of fear, since his handwriting wasn't as good as it used to be, to overlook something when the question of his connection came up on the line. He might have written none of the words caretaker to the kids when he halted. May have written prospective guardian pressing the pen instead. More difficult than required. He nodded and returned the forms without a ceremony. The clerk informed him that he would be called shortly, and that a court date may follow a home visit when they were evaluated in the upcoming week. Studying would be necessary, and there would be additional paperwork, interviews, and checks. Didn't bat an eye as he left. He went to the hardware shop to get some items such as new window latches, additional locks, and a smoke alarm for the nursery's owner. Before he even asked, an old friend of his father's gave him a discount. Thomas thanked him, saying that was the least he could do to let him know he was doing something right. He snatched him up and hurried off, not trusting himself to say anything more. He went to the post office to pick some food, additional baby wipes, and a new washing basket. Office and discovered 3 envelopes, one from the drugstore, one from child services, and a handwritten letter with. The message said, "You're not alone." It had no signature and no return address, simply that he spent a considerable amount of time sitting in the truck and gazing at the note the baby were waiting, and since their next meal was almost here, he slipped the card into the glove box, and he started the engine and proceeded through the procedures using warm diapers and rehearsed care bottles back at the farmhouse. Lola Bibas hummed, and he stopped speculating. After the kids were born, there was a complete rhythm and flow that night. Down and the dishes were finished, he sat in the nursery with the radio set to an oldie station and the lamp on low. The house was silent as the chair swayed gently and steadily, but now it didn't seem empty, and he thought about Catherine instead of the piercing agony. Something used to cut through him, but she would have known what to do if it had hurt softly. He glanced at the toys and clothing in the room, wondering if she would have enjoyed them, the little lives playing out before him. It wasn't only a stopgap measure. It wasn't simply a stopgap anymore. It was a start. There will be more tomorrow. Doubts, more steps, and more inquiries, but tonight he understood what he'd decided, that they were now his in every manner. That, despite the fact that winter had not completely lost its grip, the days became longer, obstinate patches of snow that continued to cling to the field's margins, and the wind that blew across the plains was still fierce, but the light was cleaner, brighter, and more. Thomas sensed the arrival of spring, not only in the change in air, the way the ground grew softer under his boots, but in the minute changes that had occurred. The nursery had taken on a life of its own, within the home and within him. Previously, an abandoned space cluttered with dust and neglected items. It was now the beating every square inch of the house's center witnessed the presence of 3 tiny lives shelves stocked with bottles, piles of diapers neatly stacked, and toys, clothes, and furnishings were folded with awkward care, mismatched, borrowed, or contributed by others who wished to assist after hearing the tale. But there was now a theme that was warm, yet lacked ornamentation beyond what was necessary. Thomas had placed Catherine's old quilt over the cribs and on the rocking chair, which was now soft from nightly usage. He made 3 mobiles himself out of little wooden pieces and bits of string, forms that slowly moved the shadows as they whirled in the air. Already each youngster had started to express their own personality via the simplest actions. Despite being no smaller, Thomas continued to refer to the girl as the tiny one, was the most peaceful to hold or lie calmly with open eyes compared to the others. One of the youngsters was requesting impatiently and vocally expressing his discontent with serious eyes when the third was his sleepy, sluggish toe, which he did not like. Thomas was frequently seen curled up with a hand close to his face, slow to weep. He had learnt to listen instead of attempting to follow what any guidebook or internet article said was typical, could see and modify the patterns that existed if one focused on the farm had altered appropriately, but the cattle continued to be kept alive by the tasks. Fences still needed to be tended and the soil will soon require turning, But now everything revolved on the kids Thomas Rose had previously dealt with. Shorter spurts, and performed more frequent checks on them than were likely required. Throughout the day, the monitors he had placed in the nursery made a little buzzing sound, always within earshot, and he frequently found himself stopping what he was doing to listen, just in case the neighbors, who had previously avoided them, now showed up with casseroles. Mornings were no longer spent alone with offers of assistance or cartons of old baby things. While a youngster slept close by or was softly rocked on a nearby surface, visitors called on the door and stayed in the kitchen over coffee. The house, which had previously been a haven of calm routine, was suddenly filled with noises, of conversation, laughing, and the gentle hum of he had to create place for everything. So he turned the mudroom into the washing room, which was used almost regularly, increased in size, arranged baby food and formula on the cupboard shelves, and the living room had long ago lost its peacefulness. He went through the list in favor of bright plastic, burp rags, and soft mats. There was a rhythm about it that was similar to farming observation, and everything happened with surprise and ease. At the feed shop, people started to welcome him not just as Tom the farmer, but because he was the one with the infants. They inquired about the kids before anything else, and he discovered that he was okay with providing them with updates without. The girl rolled over this morning. They're eating more now, I believe. The middle child enjoys music, and he even started writing a journal as if to report on the weather or the grain prediction. He kept a tiny notepad in his shirt pocket, recording the minor turning points as they happened, although he wasn't sure if he would require them for documentation in court or just for the purpose of recollection. He was aware that the first time one of the lads chuckled, and honest, he wanted to recall the precise moment of the gurgling chuckle that startled them both. It made a difference what music was playing on the radio that day. Some days were more difficult others. On other evenings, none of the kids slept for longer than an hour at a time, or formula splattering on the floor in the mornings after a bottle was dumped, or lengthy. There were times in the afternoons when Thomas doubted what he was doing, and he stood among the dishes and clothes in the center of the kitchen. People were sobbing and feeling. His chest would rise with an overpowering wave of fatigue, but then one would fall, slumbering on his shoulder, or grinning up at him while drooling, and the tide would pass. It wasn't precisely peaceful, but anything better. The farm had minor setbacks. The fields hadn't been tilled yet. The fences had been neglected for too long, and the animals saw his distracted focus and realized he was behind them, having missed an early calf symptoms of sickness and had been dealing with it for a day while feeling guilty. But he told himself that, as the seasons changed, there was always time to catch up. Soil would wait as usual since he had recruited a local adolescent to come on. The tall, awkward youngster who helped with the barn on Saturdays didn't ask many questions. Thomas was well suited to the inquiries, and he demonstrated how to feed the animals. The child rapidly learned how to clean the stables and check the water pipes, didn't mind the long hours. One day, he claimed that the farm was quieter than his house. The youngster questioned abruptly while they were putting hay side by side. "You really keeping them the babies?" "That is." Thomas straightened his back after finishing his duties. "Yuck." Child simply shrugged and resumed hauling bales after nodding back and said, "I am," as though that were the most logical response possible. That night after the infants were, Thomas brought them all into the nursery after they had been cleaned and clothed in fresh pajamas. Before going to bed, he read to them, although they didn't really comprehend what he was saying. However, his voice appeared to soothe them as he read almanacs from the ancient farm, children's books, occasionally newspaper stories or whatever. The rhythm that mattered, he sat in the rocker. It was peaceful as the boys snuggled against his chest and gazed about the room. The wind had died in the silence, the soft buzz of the baby monitor and the weight of the infant in his arms. Down, and he studied how the moonlight created gentle patterns on the floor. Catherine frequently, now, not in the same achingly harsh manner as before, but softly as if her memories had become ingrained in the home along with everything else. He occasionally found himself speaking aloud to her while the kids were sleeping, saying her about the day, including the minor victories and the annoyances over items he believed would amuse her, or he pictured her nodding while seated across from him, Perhaps she was grinning because he had no idea how the world operated. He simply knew that Mom would have cherished these kids despite all he could see. She would have viewed them as neither mysteries nor burdens but gifts. He let the chair sway them both into silence while closing his eyes. There was still a part of him that found it hard to accept that he would have 3 children, abruptly and quickly become the focal point of it, so that he, of all after years of stillness, a man may learn to adapt to the commotion. However, he had faith that the farm would find its way, and he would too. He said something to each of them before getting up from the chair and carefully placing the infant in the cot. The stars were brilliant and crisp when the light was off outside, and somewhere in that a distance a dog barked once before being quiet once again. Because the wind was, the home was filled, the fields were being moved, and the rhythm of farm life had settled into a precarious equilibrium that started with early dawn. The hall, Thomas would hear the muted screams of waking newborns and light slanting through the bedroom window, rise before the alarm like he had previously. But today he was motivated not just by habit but also by the bottles were warmed as coffee was made to meet the urgent demands of 3 little lives waiting on the other side of the nursery door. Brewed, the floorboards groaned beneath his steps, and the stove came to life with a recognizable click. He was lifting, changing, and comforting the children as he went from one to the next. No longer odd. It was no longer a disturbance. It was just life. Finally, the weather had changed. The breeze blowing across the plains was warmer and less biting, and the earth was starting to give way. Thomas would walk the edges in the mornings while the kids were asleep, and the duties allowed it. Of his fields, savoring the texture of the ground beneath his boots while he listened to the birds returning to the countryside was awakened by the seasonal posts. Was starting over. But even as the days got fuller and the home got brighter, anew at the periphery of his thoughts, a shadow had started to emerge. It wasn't a single event or discussion, but in the little moments that add up. Monica Reyes called a state-issued letter with a clipped tone that was stamped with official assessments and supervision, a fresh voice from the Department of Family Services calls and requests to set up an interview, and then knock on the door early one last time. Thomas was surprised when she introduced herself on Thursday morning as Elaine Murray, a regional case supervisor, was tasked with examining the placement's peculiar circumstances. Clean, professional, and charming in her early 40s. Yet there was she wasn't here to swap, but her reserved demeanor didn't escape him. She requested to visit the kids as part of the niceties she was here to make. Thomas first complied, guiding her around the home with his calm composure. Had been accustomed to the nursery being hygienic, the infants being changed and fed heads rotating when they lie in their cribs or on a soft playmate on the floor. She knelt next to them and examined them in response to the stranger's voice. Standing back with his arms folded, he observed, not in an unpleasant but cold manner. They sat in the kitchen after that, and she pulled out a folder and inquired about routines, health data, sleep patterns, and the development of the babies. She inquired about. He answered all of them with a firm voice, including income, insurance, and medical visits. His gaze remained fixed, so she inquired about the future. "What are your long-term goals, Mr. Grayson?" "I'm now applying for permanent." She looked up from her papers as he added, "Guardianship. And you realize what that implies?" "I do. It's a lifetime commitment, I know." A quiet ensued, and he could sense it extending like a tight wire between them. "You live alone," she replied cautiously. "This would be a remarkable endeavor for anyone in their 50s. Do you have a network in place even with support?" He pointed to a list of names, attached to the refrigerator, the part-time nurse who visited. "Twice a week the neighbors' acquaintances, week we got by." She nodded, but her face remained same as she looked, bottles drying in the rack and the spotless worktops throughout the kitchen. "It's admirable," she eventually replied, referring to the toys neatly arranged in a basket at the door. "What you've done, standing up the way you did." Thomas remained silent, knowing. "But we have to consider the best interests of the children," she added, adding that there was more to come. The best interests of the children, not his. was the words he had been dreading. Affection, not his concern, not the cozy bodies resting soundly beneath his roof, the several evenings he had led them to sleep, the early mornings he had roused to calm their sobs, or the manner, when he entered a room. They searched for him, but it didn't matter whether someone after another half hour she decided it wasn't enough and departed. Her folder, and with measured courtesy, she promised to get in contact with her shortly. Thomas guided her to a formal evaluation that would happen within the month. The door and observed as her vehicle vanished along the gravel road, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. He sat in the living room with the lights out and a fire crackling softly that night after the infants had finally fallen asleep. He gazed into the flames as the shadows danced around the walls of the fireplace. The terror had taken hold, but it wasn't loud or overpowering. It was colder than that silence, so terror-struck. The sort of terror that hid in the recesses of his thoughts and waited for inquiries to be spoken, failed to come up with a suitable response. What if they are taken? What if all you've done? What if they don't believe in you? He got up and walked down. Still insufficient? The hallway inspecting the nursery door, the kids were soundly asleep, and he leaned against the frame with his arms folded, unperturbed, and listened to the sound of their breath. And he remained there for a while before starting to make calls the following morning. He started by talking to Monica, who said in a sharp yet understanding tone, "You knew this was a part of it's the system, Thomas," she said softly, "and we can't avoid it. I want to do this right," he said, ready. She offered to assist where she could, suggesting that he speak with a lawyer. A guardianship law expert offered him names and instructed him to collect supporting proof in the form of letters. He phoned the pastor, who volunteered to write a statement, and provided any proof that would demonstrate his eligibility. He requested the weekly visiting nurse, and she readily consented. The drugstore clerk promised to attest to him, the owner of the feed shop, and the retired teacher who occasionally, as he fixed the tractor, he spent an hour watching the infants, and each one spoke in their own words. He is doing it, and he is showing up. Concerns. He reached out to a lawyer called Jill Whitaker, who had 2 meetings with him. Days later at a little town office, she was youthful, angular, and instantly. Not rudely, she stated. They'll be looking for reasons to say no, adding, "Your age, your income, your lack of a companion. And what do I have? A community with a clean record and consistency assistance and 3 kids who already consider you their own." She handed him a list of paperwork to schedule appointments, and he completed each form one at a time. Another slow and cautious penmanship. He took a first aid course after attending a course on newborn CPR. The community center started, assembling a binder of knowledge more substantial than the planting catalogs that before piled up beside his desk each spring. And while he worked, the anxiety altered. It didn't completely disappear, but it was replaced by something more resilient. He had previously thought that his life was over, and that the narrative ended with. The world had written his final chapter with Catherine's death, yet he had being incorrect. These kids had shattered something, and as a result, through all there was a sort of hope that he wasn't sure how to describe. Whether they had picked him, fate had, or it was an accident, it made no difference. What mattered now was the decision he made. In exchange, he refused to let them leave, because they were due to him, not because he was more deserving of them than anybody else, but because he had loved them into his life, and he was unable to acknowledge the truth of that love. Longer apart from himself, and on the day of the inspection, he wore. While the infants were sleeping that morning, Daddy manually ironed his nicest shirt, prepared a backpack with extra clothing, beverages, and blankets for each of them in case he read to them that evening after printing out all of the documents the lawyer had requested and organizing them in a folder. His voice remained firm as usual, despite his hands shaking a little as he turned the pages. Saw him yawning and blinking gently before kissing each one on the forehead before putting them down and making hushed vows he hadn't said out loud. Previously, when the house was quiet and the fire was low and the wind was, he got back, up and stood at the window gazing out over the fields. Everything may change tomorrow, but today they were his, and he would do all in his power to defend that reality on the morning of. The hearing took place above the Grayson farm in a thick, chilly fog. Was a blanket of gentle, uninterrupted gray that smothered the light and brought peace. The barn was in a still shadow, and the gravel road was glistening with dew. Thomas awakened before the alarm, holding its breath, not from the sounds of the newborns, but he spent a few minutes lying in bed because of his own discomfort. The scale of the old home, the sound of the familiar creaks, the silence of the all of the labor, the uncertainty and the wind outdoors today would come to a head. The shaky optimism he had been cultivating for the previous few weeks would all be evaluated by an unfamiliar person who may have never set foot on land, never heard a calf breathe for the first time, and never remained awake all night, holding a child with a fever. Yet what roused him was not rage, but he got up and dressed in the silence, feeling more prepared than ever. Selecting the identical button-down shirt he wore to his wedding, which had been stored in plastic for years, at the rear of the closet, despite the fact that his shoulders were considerably wider, and even though the cloth no longer smelled like the lavender sachets Catherine used to stash in the drawers, he promptly rolled his sleeves just to the right and carefully pressed each button, wrist, and took a quick look at himself. The guy staring back at him in the mirror above the dresser was. He was sturdy, yet exhausted. And this morning alone, his eyes were free of terror. Resolved the infants had woken up as normal, seemingly oblivious to the seriousness of the day that lay ahead. Milk for a change, and the third just because the space had expanded. Quiet Thomas confidently and with habitual ease navigated the exercise. His mind was calm. The diaper bag was prepared and the bottles were already warmed. The evening before 3 soft onesies. They had even laid out their clothes, including a matching set that a neighbor had given them. By 7:30, my own children had grown up and were in the truck, neatly wrapped, blankets fastened into used car seats that a church member had provided, and he double-checked each one, tightening the as he moved into the road. The heater hummed and straps adjusted the mirrors, missing. The journey to the county courthouse required holding on to the windshield's edges. The vehicle rumbled slowly across the rural roads in the fog for little over an hour. Thomas spoke little, as the sun made a feeble attempt to rise and parted, like a curtain. When one of the boys fussed during the journey, his hand stayed in a quiet humming motion, firmly on the steering wheel, his thoughts focused on the future. And he arrived in time to spare Jill Whitaker, wearing a Navy outfit, greeted him at the entryway with a clipboard. She appeared much younger than she actually was, with a blazer and gray pants. When she noticed the kids reaching out to touch one of their blankets, she grinned and used gentle, cautious fingertips. He carried the twins. "They look good," she remarked. "They are," Thomas responded. Jill snatched the third, the courtroom security guard, while he took one in each arm, nodded at them as they went by, choosing not to interrogate a man who had 3 babies and a lawyer with him, waited outside the bench in courtroom C after riding the elevator to the 3rd floor. The courtroom was made of plain oak, and the lights above them were excessively harsh and chilly. Benches, an elevated podium for the judge, and a wall-mounted state seal. Everything had a subtle scent of old paper, and the walls were painted that hue. A clerk went silently around the room, polishing furniture and making coffee. Thomas recognized the social worker who was organizing papers on the judge's desk in the room. A few rows back during a previous visit, looking over the notes the babies were, Jill slumped back, feeling a little sleepy from the rod and the warm air lulling in the corridor, over and repeated the instructions in a whisper. But Thomas recalled when to talk, listen, and anticipate the judgment at precisely 9. When she walked in, her silver hair was pushed back securely, and she looked older than he had anticipated. She wore spectacles low on her nose, making it impossible to see her face as she brought the hearing to order, greeted the chamber, and spoke to each person individually. Following that, Thomas, Jill, and the Child Protective Services agents opened the folder in front of her and started reading the proceedings, which first proceeded slowly. The reading of the case report and the infant's condition is usual procedure. Thomas listened to the emergency placement authorization and the first discovery report as his name, employment, and day of birth were, all described in bland official terms, discovered the children under his care assuming. Jill then spoke, presenting the binder they had created together that had records of his everyday activities. Financial statements, health records, letters from neighbors, and statements from. She spoke with the local pastor and visiting nurse with assurance and kindness. With assurance that could only result from extensive planning, Thomas saw the judges. Her brows furrowed slightly before smoothing again as she flipped each page. Then the testimony began, and the visiting nurse was called. First, she stood up and talked to. She spoke of Thomas's warmth and composed authority, his ability to obey directions and show patience. She described how the kids reacted to the pastor, a kind guy, then explained to him how they were flourishing under. His care guy had a battered leather Bible in his coat pocket and wore a black suit. Discussed not just Thomas's personality, but also the transformation he had witnessed in him since the children came. The softening of someone who had before appeared to be lost in sorrow. The appearance of someone revitalized by when Thomas was finally summoned. He stood and gave the final baby to the unexpected love. When Jill and I moved to the front of the room, there was total quiet. The court requested that he give his identity, his intentions, and his comprehension of the duties he was looking for. He said bluntly, I don't have a large family or a perfect house, but I do have a home, he added, referring to his youth, and I've learnt to take care of them, so I have space in it for them. I'm prepared to dedicate the rest of my life to ensuring them safety and affection because I adore them. Return, the truth was stated without a dramatic pause or prepared statement. The judge clearly gave a single nod before turning to face the younger woman who was the CPS agent. Unknown to Thomas, she stood and expressed a calm viewpoint, acknowledging the peculiar circumstances of the case and the possible issues. But she also recognized the obvious signs of concern, the lack of better alternatives, and the influential. The court addressed one more question after hearing the testimonies of support. Do you understand that this will not be transient? This is not a gesture, nor a placeholder that these, according to the law, children will be yours with all the responsibilities and rights that go along with it, Thomas said, and you're ready to assume that duty both now and in the future. The judge glanced down at her notes before turning to face the infants, who were now quietly staring in the carrier and in Jill's arms. Alongside the table, I've gone over the records, the testimonies, and the suggestion from the department, she stated. I think it's in the best desire of the minors to keep the petition under Mr. Thomas Grayson's supervision. Congratulations, Mr. Grayson, for guardianship is thus given a pause. Are yours. Thomas was unable to breathe for a time, and he heard Jill exhale next to him. Sensed the courtroom's quiet change to something cozier and more intimate with the babies. Unaware of the gravity of the situation, he started to fuss and rushed involuntarily toward them, lifting the closest one into his later. As his arms rocked softly, others came up to him. The clerk who had observed from behind the bench, the minister, and the nurse all offered words of gratitude, blessings, and congrats that he hardly noticed. With her eyes brighter than ever, Jill put a hand on his shoulder and grinned. Together they walked out of the courthouse into the crisp air of a day that had finally turned into spring. The walkway was warmed by the sun shining through patches of mist that had lifted. Thomas buckled the infants back into the vehicle one by one beneath their feet, paused, hands resting on the roof, gaze raised to the sky. And were they no longer waiting, uncertain, or questions? The road felt different under his tires, and the country felt different as he drove home. The farm awaited the fields as they rolled out in front of him, both familiar and unfamiliar. His life, which he had believed to be over, had really started over. On the way home from the courthouse this time, he wasn't alone himself. Ran softly, through the county's center, going through farms and following the river's gradual bend, had only just started to emerge from the lengthy hold of winter, leaving the trees naked, stretched their fingers into the sky, and occasionally, a sliver of green touched the ground where they had been. The soil was getting ready for the crops that had previously stood. Everything was moving once again as Thomas pushed his hands steadily forward. He felt as if he had joined the tranquil beat of the wheel in the gentle breathing of the babies behind. Him season's return, he remained silent during the journey since his heart was full and there was no need. With an odd, glowing silence, there was an ache. Not one of loss, though, but it was the weight of something sacred, the silent understanding that the children were his, yet they were no longer, in the language of signatures, not only in heart and habit, but in the eyes of the law. With official declarations and seals, everything was completed and authentic, would not be undone, as the home welcomed them with the aroma of warm air and wood smoke. The dog is getting older, and the fire in the hearth is still blazing dimly from the morning. When they arrived, at the door, a shepherd mix who had warmed to the infants with unexpected kindness greeted them by wagging gently, and Thomas took the kids inside as they sniffed at the corners of the covers, one by one, placing them in their crib next to the window where gentle light comes in, made their faces sparkle as it passed through the drapes. The home was still outside. A bird cried from the edge of the grass as the wind moved it. He stood for a long time in the barn inside the walls, where the solitude was a blessing. The girl's mouth twitched as though she was dreaming when she was in the nursery watching them sleep. Thomas moved down to carefully pull his blanket back over him after one of the youngsters kicked it away. His hands were still rough from years of field work, but in recent months they moved with a care that even startled him. Every move was silently certain, and every touch held intention. It was more than just knowing what to do. He had developed as the days passed. Knowledge gradually increased like the soil did as it grew into spring. Did April bring longer light and soil that could be tilled again in the mornings to the farm? Started early as always, but this time they started with the gentle rustling of covers. When the infant awakened and groped for his arms among the hum of people, he discovered how. He tied them to his chest in carriers and carried one infant at a time while measuring their meal with the other hand. He checked posts with one hand as he moved around the fence's perimeter, and when the weather permitted, he lay a blanket on the grass and placed them down to protect their eyes from the sun, repaired equipment close by, pausing every few minutes to talk to them and let them know he was near, and the youngster kept getting support from every Saturday. The town came back to take care of the more difficult tasks, and neighbors stopped by to volunteer to do errands and provide food. After volunteering to read to the kids twice a week, a retired teacher from the nearby village quickly rose to. She was a regular in their brief routine, and they nicknamed her Miss Ada. Her voice was kind, and Rich furnished the nursery with picture books and nursery songs. The children's growth was uneventful and gradual rather than rapid. When given affection and care, living creatures started to turn over and giggle more. When he entered the room, they frequently reached for him, and their personalities intensified. Though the girl stayed the most composed, her eyes constantly observing and quietly examining the environment. The middle son was a wiggling ball of action who screamed and was noisy and eager. The youngest was still his, and he laughed the hardest and spoke the loudest. The sleeper is most content when he is cuddled up against Thomas's chest, with his thumb in his mouth, and with the world at a distance, Thomas constructed, they could safely sleep under the open sky in the playyard next to the porch, which is fenced off by a plot of grass. He covered the ground with heavy blankets, laid out a canopy to protect them from the sun, and cushions. The dog was lying close by, always on guard from the porch, things plainly while he shelled peas, fixed a hose handle, or just sat drinking a glass of water and allowing the season's warmth to seep into his bones. He frequently communicated to them using genuine tales rather than simply the simplistic language of lullabies and feeding times, ancient ones, the ones Catherine used to get him to have late at night when the fields were silent and the stars were close, informed them about their grandmother's lavender planting behind the barn. He informed them about the time he got because she loved how it caught the early light. During harvest, she was trapped in a downpour and waited on the porch using a towel and a talk. He explained that they had once dreamed of saturating the home with children, but when time and stillness had dimmed the dream, he informed them that, even though he had no idea who had abandoned them or why they had come to him in the most unlikely of circumstances, were not mishaps, burdens, or riddles to be solved. Rather, they were his children were the seed he sowed without anticipating the results. He had never dared to hope since he observed a silent ceremony to recognize each milestone. When one of them sat up straight for the first time without assistance, the first tooth-rambled words that may have been his name, scrawled the dates on the calendar, and took notes in his little notebook, and put pictures on tape above the mantel, constructed toy shelves, and installed anew, they etched their initials into the wood of a young apple tree and planted it next to the garden, swinging it to the porch beam. That summer, the home no longer had a sign anchored at its roots. The sound of mellow music coming from the radio and the shuffling of little feet on the ground, the rocking chair's creak, and Thomas's quiet voice as he read loudly at night, the drapes and windows, were left open to the breeze. The moonlight fell in glittering stripes as they danced like ghosts. Thomas sat in the dark, listening to their breathing, across the crib, occasionally believing that this was the life he had always been supposed to lead. He changed his routines and planted, but he still worked the land, albeit less than previously. Less acres and concentrated on what he could control. He sold some of the outdated machinery. More books and a nicer stroller were purchased with the funds to extend the nursery, used high chair. It was a new type of job that went beyond just growing the land, but growing the future on a warm Sunday in August. When he initially brought them to church in the morning, the congregation welcomed them, welcoming them, and the priest talked about families' second chances. During the hymns, the infants wriggled and laughed, not because of blood, but because of grace. And Thomas, who was standing at the rear with one in each arm and the third dozing in the carrier over his breast, and then others approached him to talk, not with amazement or sympathy, yet they were kind enough to inquire about names, sleep patterns. The next time a lady slipped a folded paper into his palm, they may bring. Later that evening, he opened it and saw the words, "You have created a family that never lets. The world makes you doubt that." And as the days went by, he stopped. Like pearls on a string, one after the other, some difficult, others simple. The majority were stunning in unexpected ways, with brief instances interwoven, a dirty fingerprint on the porch rail, a first step, a brief and flawless giggle, a muttered phrase, a gaze exchanged, a life developing in silent delight by the time the first leaves turned, the infants crawled, and the girl arrived at the initially. She pulled herself up to gaze across the yard. In awe, the others followed, each with their own obstinate gaze and at their own pace. Determination. One evening as the sun went down, Thomas observed them with a pride he had never had before. He sat with them on the porch overlooking the fields, the sky-painted roses and gold, and the apple tree next to the garden had grown bigger, its branches stretching higher toward the departing light, its leaves black and dense, and he cradled the youngest in his lap while the other two rested on his legs, gazing out over the countryside. And Thomas joined them in looking at the property, which was peaceful. He murmured to them when he was sleeping, and in the quiet between seasons. He spoke the words, "You are home," knowing full well that he was now. Please remember to subscribe to the channel if you liked this article. For more touching tales, see our previous films and feel free to share so you don't miss the next. On this one with a potential needy person today.